All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Keith Robinson. Joining me is Nate Babcock. We are two small town pastors, and welcome to our Small Town Pastors video blog. A little bit of what we are planning on doing here is periodically the two of us will be getting together, having these conference meetings with one another to discuss various issues that come up in the church or topics that we may not necessarily discuss at like a sermon level or a Bible study level, but are still important things to talk about in the church. And so this gives us an opportunity to connect with one another, as well as to connect with you on some of these different options. So today, to kind of get us kicked off, started, and all that good stuff, we're going to be introducing ourselves a little bit more in depth, talking about who we are, how we've gotten into ministry, where we are at now, since many of you will not know who one or the other of us are, and then kind of in the future, be diving into some more of the core issues and elements of what goes on in the church. So Nate, would you like to start us off on kind of giving a little bit of an introduction of who you are, where you come from, all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Nate Babcock, as Keith said. Currently, I am the senior minister at Buchanan Christian Church in Buchanan, Michigan, which is a little town of, I don't know, about 5,000 people, nestled in the southwest corner of Michigan, about 20 minutes from Lake Michigan. Been here at Buchanan Christian Church for going on, well, I'm in my ninth year. I had to do a little math in my head. In my ninth year here at BCC, that's our shorthand for it. And BCC is actually the reason Keith and I know one another, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a few minutes. So yeah, I came here to Buchanan Christian Church in 2012. Prior to that, my family and I, we were in Lincoln, Illinois. I was studying and working at Lincoln Christian Seminary and also preaching at a small church near Danville, Illinois. So the church itself was a couple of hours from Lincoln. That was a part-time rather than full-time ministry. And we lived in Lincoln for a little more than 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was in ministry actually with my home church in Plymouth, Indiana, for about 6 years. And prior to that, I was in New Hampshire. After I graduated from Bible college, which I went to Great Lakes Christian College in Lansing, Michigan. After I graduated from Bible college, my wife and I moved to New Hampshire, and I did an internship with a new church, relatively new church. I think when I arrived there, it was only about 9 months old, in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was Rising Sun Christian Church at the time. I think they've since changed their name. But a post-graduation internship there, which was an excellent outside of the Midwest box kind of experience. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of my history of where I've been in ministry. And I think, we can come back to how I ended up in ministry, but Keith, would like to hear about your journey in ministry, where you're at, and that I'm sure that journey will bring us back to why we're connected through Buchanan.
Right. So I might actually just start off with that.
Okay.
Buchanan Christian Church, where Nate is the minister, is my home church. My family has a very long history.
Very long.
BCC, yes. We are descended from the founding pastor of the congregation. That was like, what, 1850 something or another?
1854.
Yeah, so I think I am the first minister in the family since Mr. Rowe, but Buchanan.
Still, it's pretty incredible.
Yes, yeah. Buchanan and my family go back a very, very long way. So I started off, actually, sort of my faith started off at the Northway Church of Christ in South Bend, Indiana. It's the first church that I was regularly involved with and a part of. We were all living in South Bend at the time, and grandma, mom, siblings, we all went to Northway. From about the time I was in 8th grade, 9th grade until my senior year of high school. That's when we switched back to Buchanan. and started going there full time, being involved in stuff there full time.
And I was not the minister of Buchanan at that time. Someone else was.
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah, that was Sean was the minister there at that time. And so Buchanan and, like I said, my family go back a long ways. They all knew everybody. And so it was sort of just sliding right back in with that family environment. And then I went to Central Christian College of the Bible out in Moberly, Missouri, to do my degree in preaching. And then still kept in pretty close contact with Buchanan while I was there. Whenever I was home on break, Buchanan is where I went, still sang with the choir and all that kind of stuff. I did 2 separate internships in Buchanan. The first was under Gordy, who was the youth minister at the time. It was the summer after my sophomore year of college. And then the second was as I was graduating from college, I worked for 6 months with the church there in Buchanan. That's how you and I got to know one another very well.
And I think that was in 2014, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So from May through December, November of 2014, I worked with you and with Gordy again, as well as working with the Capital Campaign.
Yes.
I officially started in full-time ministry in January of 2015. My first congregation was the Seaman Church of Christ in Seaman, Ohio. I was there for a little over 5.5 years. And then I came to the Cave City Christian Church in Cave City, Kentucky, which is where I am at now. And I've been here since September of last year. Cave City is kind of on the southern portion of Kentucky, just about 25 miles north of Bowling Green, kind of right in the heart of where Mammoth Cave and all of that stuff is. And it's been an interesting experience, kind of transitioning into ministry in the midst of COVID and everything else.
Yeah, right.
A lot of stuff you would normally do when you start ministry, I haven't been able to do. Things as simple as just going to somebody's house. We don't really do that at the moment.
Right.
There have been some unique challenges to starting ministry in the midst of all of this, but it's been good overall.
I apologize for the ringing phone. I forgot to take the batteries out of that thing. Prevent that from happening.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So how?
So yeah, Keith. I had the privilege of working with Keith there for 6 months in 2014, and I was still pretty new into my ministry. I think it was a second full year of my ministry here at Buchanan Christian Church, and as Keith said, during that time we were involved in a capital campaign. Our building needed a lot of repairs and several upgrades. And so we had to raise the money for that. And Keith, along with one of the members of our congregation, Karen, they co-led that campaign. And that among many other things, just sold me on Keith as a leader, as a minister, because I was blown away by his organizational ability. Here was a young man that had basically just graduated from Bible college, and he was more than capable, more than equal to the task of providing the organizational leadership needed for us to conduct a capital campaign and raise quite a bit of money and do it well, communicate with the congregation well, and do things in an orderly, systematic fashion. And his teammate, Karen, was also a very organized, detail-oriented person, so they made a good team. And but I just remember, when I graduated from Bible college, when I was Keith's age, it would have been a severe mistake to entrust me with such a responsibility as that. So Keith has many strengths, but an organization is one of them, and he did such an excellent job in helping our congregation through that process. And something, churches have had fights and splits and problems over building programs, and it was a blessing to us in just about every conceivable way. And Keith was a large part of the reason why.
Well, I think a large part of that also was that it wasn't necessarily me leading and creating this whole thing as it was this whole team of people all collaborating. And we had Jerry Paul who was coming in. It was really, his campaign program.
Yes, it was his program
That we were doing, and you were handling all of the teaching components of it. And within Jerry's framework, we had 12 different teams within the congregation who all each had a portion that they contributed. And that made a big difference. It wasn't on any one individual to say, here, you have to go and create this whole thing from scratch and everything. It was everybody coming together doing their part. And my job was really just coordinating where all of the little pieces fell into place.
Right. And I was thinking that before we started this phone call, I was reflecting on one of the great moments from that year, that experience of having Keith on our team was the famous debate sermon.
Yes. That was great.
Go ahead, Keith, tell the story. Right.
So Nate was preaching through the book of Romans for 10 years.
Yeah. Right.
How many? It was 50?
It was 40 some,
So it was a very good, very in-depth study. But it's sort of to help break up the thing into pieces.
The monotony.
I wasn't going to say it.
It was.
To make things different and unique. There is a portion in Romans, Romans 13, Romans
13 to 14, yeah.
Where Paul presents this sort of argument about how do you handle disagreements in the church over what are more or less minor issues.
Yeah, secondary matters.
Yeah, the example that he gives is food. Some people, because of their faith, their background and stuff, they were only willing to eat vegetables, and other people said, well, God has given us the ability to eat anything and everything, so we're not going to limit. And just kind of how you deal with an issue like that. And so building on that, Nate, Gordy, who was the youth minister, and myself put together a mock debate sermon where I was the moderator. Nate was presenting the argument for you should only eat vegetables.
Vegetables only.
And Gordy was presenting the argument that everybody should eat meat and anything and everything that their heart desires. And it was hilarious when we got into it, because you were dressed up in all trim and proper, full 3-piece suit.
I had a celery stick in my suit, or my shirt pocket. Yeah.
And Gordy came in wearing a bandana and a bucket of chicken and all this other.
Yeah, a big thing of Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Right. So we definitely turned a few heads during that particular sermon.
That was great.
But it was fun. It was good.
It was fun. So Keith, talk about your call into ministry, how you came to believe and understand that this was, God's will for your life.
Mm-hmm. So ironically, a large part of that came about while doing and participating in a different capital campaign, also led by Jerry Paul at the Northway Church of Christ. At the time, I was a sophomore in high school. It'd been about a year or two since I had started regularly attending church and becoming serious about my faith. By that time, I had started teaching a kindergarten Sunday school class and working just as part of the youth group, Vacation Bible School, all these kinds of things being just kind of thrown in the mix, starting to experience what life on that side of the church and ministry and things looks like.
Right.
And I was a part of the capital campaign, just a very small portion. There was a youth team included in it. And so I was, one of the contributors on that. And my grandmother was the team chairman. So I was helping her with some of the stuff she was doing. And we got through sort of the initial phase of the campaign. Jerry had done his surveys. We put together the teams, done a bunch of just preliminary stuff. And I remember he took one of the Sunday evening services to sort of present his initial findings and his thoughts and opinions on what the congregation should do. And he went through all of that stuff. And they specifically were wanting to basically expand the sanctuary, was the primary thing that the congregation wanted to do, because they were doing a morning and they were doing 2 morning services, an early morning and then a regular morning service. The capacity was pretty limited, especially in the regular service. And so they wanted to make this big, huge sanctuary expansion to be able to hold more people. And Jerry told them, that's all well and good, but at the moment, your focus is so much on the older generation. Your main church growth has come from the older generation. That if you keep that focus, if you don't change your directive there, in 10 years, your congregation's going to die off. That's just the reality of how things work. I think the statistic is that approximately 10% of a congregation will cease to be there over the course of a year due to death or illness or moving away or that kind of stuff. You have to gain 10% every year just to
break even.
Yeah. And so, as he's telling them all of that, I started just kind of thinking in the back of my head, well, I'm one of the only people here who's not part of the older generation. So what does that mean for me? What is my role in this congregation and in church in general supposed to be? So I thought about it for a little bit, and then I decided to ask my grandmother, Janet Craw, she was a very, very dedicated church lady all her life.
Yes, she was.
Was part of the Buchanan church and the Northway church, and for just decades and decades, and would do anything and everything she possibly could to help others out. And I was talking with her just sort of in passing and said, I've been thinking about what Jerry said, and just, what would you think if I did decide to make the choice to go into ministry as part of the next generation, as wanting to deepen my own faith and help others through it? And I remember her saying, she had just this like bright, wide-eyed expression on her face that, that is what I've been praying for. I just didn't want to say anything and influence you without it being your decision. So that was sort of really steered me on, this is probably what I should do. I talked with Ed Erskine, who was the minister there at the time, about it, and he was very encouraging. There was an retired elder, his name was Norman Downs, in that congregation as well. I talked with him some. He had been a minister for most of his life, and then he decided, because he and his wife were downsizing, to give me a few books, is the way he put it. I'll give you a few books to help you out on your start in ministry. And when I went to his house, it was like 200 and something books that he ended up giving me. So my ministry library was all set, ready to go. From him. But that's sort of how I got on this path, was just the question of, what should my role in the church be as somebody that's coming at it from perhaps a slightly different perspective than a lot of the other people were in the church that I was attending at the time.
I suppose we should explain, because we've mentioned his name a couple of times, Jerry Paul. Jerry, for those of you that may not know, has been a very influential minister and leader in the Christian churches and churches of Christ in primarily Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, although his influence is limited to those areas. But he started and grew 2 significant congregations in the Fort Wayne area, Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he was the president of Great Lakes Christian College for a few years. He was the president there during my freshman year, 1998, the 1998 to 1999 school year at Great Lakes. And that was actually his last year as president. But because of Jerry's stature and influence, he's just made an impact on many congregations. And many young men such as Keith and myself, because Buchanan Christian Church is also Jerry's home church,
Right.
which is crazy, but it is. Jerry grew up here in Buchanan. And so when I came here, I knew Jerry from him having been the president when I was at Great Lakes Christian College. But when I came here to Buchanan to become the senior minister, Jerry was actually consulting with their search committee during that time, their decision-making process. And so he reached out to me while I was still in the interview process with Buchanan Christian Church. And that established a relationship between he and I, and he's really become a mentor to me as well over the last 8 or 9 years. Someone that a lot of us have looked up to and learned from in a lot of different things. So for myself, very briefly, I discerned God's call to enter vocational ministry through the influence of my mentor, Larry Ferguson. Larry was the preacher at my home church in Plymouth, Indiana. He came there when I was in high school, and I had been raised in the church and accepted Christ and was baptized at the age of 10. But during my teenage years, as most teenagers are wont to do, I was doing my own thing, not really following Jesus seriously, and went off into a pathway of sin. And a combination of meeting the young lady who would become my wife and Larry's influence helped me get back in the right direction. And it was around the age, I suppose, of 19, something like that, through Larry's influence, as he took me under his wing. And I had rededicated my life to Christ. I was growing spiritually, and Larry just began to give me opportunities for ministry and exposure to ministry. He trusted me with teaching I think a young adults or teenagers Bible school class. Let me write articles in the church newspaper. Took me with him on calls to hospitals and nursing homes, and visiting people in their homes. Started eventually including me on elders meetings. Gave me my first opportunities to preach. And so we developed a tremendous friendship and relationship, even though there was a 50-year age difference between us. Larry and I did. And so he was a spiritual mentor to me and a ministry mentor, and it was through his influence and that exposure and those opportunities that he gave me that I discerned God's call to enter vocational ministry. And for me, my number one and primary passion was I wanted to study the Bible, and I wanted to preach. And so, and mixed in there is how I met my wife, and we became married, and all that, but that's not really directly relevant to this conversation. But it's interesting. I like hearing these stories, and I like talking to other ministers about them. It's just interesting to me the different means and circumstances and ways that God uses to call people into this vocation.
Right. And I think, when we look through scripture, this is the way he has always operated, though. Is, the way he calls Moses is very different than the way he calls Abraham or Peter or Paul or many of these other individuals. He takes sort of where you are at and works in that moment to bring you to a place you never would have expected to be.
That's so true, right? Burning bush, fishing on a boat, vision of the Lord in the temple, that's Isaiah, right? Yeah, so true, Keith. God does meet us where we're at.
Yes.
And communicate to us, often through what is immediate, what we're familiar with, right? Yeah. Sometimes in ways that are very unfamiliar, right?
Yes.
Attention getting, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, for those of you at home, wondering at this point why I should be listening to these two random people.
That's a good. Why on earth would anybody want to listen to us, right?
Yeah. So building upon our shared experiences in ministry, as well as our differences in ministry and experiences and backgrounds, our goal here is to talk about various things that'll come up in the church. One of them being church leadership development, how you go about some of these things. But using, again, our connectedness and our experiences to have sort of just this conversational time of learning, both from one another as well as perhaps also from you at home. If you want to communicate to us, different questions or things like that along the way, you'd be welcome to do so. This is our goal here, I guess, is just to sort of be informal, relaxed, have a little bit of fun, and use that also as a time of instruction. Again, in areas that we might not normally talk, as far as sermons or lessons or stuff. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, so I like to think of this as, in some ways, Keith and I are having a conversation and learning from each other.
Mhm.
But we also want to welcome others into this conversation, and we want to know how we can have conversations in ways that will benefit you in your ministry context. Maybe you have some questions or some things you'd like to talk about or discuss, and we are not setting ourselves up as experts here, right? We're practitioners, we're ministry practitioners who are learning, and we've learned a few things along the way. We've got a lot more to learn, but there's a lot of value in reflecting together and sharing together our experiences, both good and bad, and as well as trying to think through things biblically, right? One of the great values. We're both again, we may have people that connect with us in this video blog that aren't from the Restoration movement. Those are our roots. The churches that we serve are independent Christian churches and churches of Christ, coming out of the Restoration movement. And one of the great strengths of the Restoration movement is its desire to be thoroughly biblical, right? But back to the scriptures, back to the scriptures, back to the scriptures. And so we certainly are going to want that to be a strong component of this, is that we're trying to think through things biblically and apply scripture directly to the questions, leadership questions, discipleship questions, ethical questions, theological questions that we deal with in ministry on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So next time, Keith.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we are hopefully going to do this about every other week or so. A lot of it's just going to be contingent upon when both Nate and I have the time available to get together and sit down and have this conversation. But yeah, roughly every other week, time willing, Lord willing. And our first upcoming topic is going to be just practical church leadership. That's a very vague, open-ended topic title, which means it's probably going to be a very open-ended discussion, and we will go off on various tangents along the way. And that will hopefully be okay. Part of the learning process is just seeing where the discussion takes you. For those of you who know me, whether you're at the church in Ohio or the church here in Cave City, this is a large part of how I teach, is just through the dialogue, through the conversation, letting it take you where it takes you. And, if you end up spending 5 minutes on your normal topic and 2 hours on everything else, well, that's fine. We'll come back to it at some point in time in the future. But yeah, our first upcoming topic will be practical church leadership. And then along the way, in further episodes, we'll be talking about what is the Restoration movement? What does it mean to be a member in a local congregation? As Nate was saying, how do you handle some of the ethical and moral questions that are becoming more and more pervasive within our culture today? And then also, there are things that particularly interest you that you would like to have included in this discussion. Feel free to send that our way, and we will do our best to accommodate it.
Yep. And we do hope to, we're calling this small town pastors because that's what we are, right? We pastor in small town contexts. And of course, we would love to hear from and connect with pastors who pastor in larger or, different contexts, right? And that
Right.
we don't certainly intend to limit ourselves, but we do identify most readily with pastors in similar situations, right? In small town contexts. And so, yeah, I guess we hope to really be able to connect with those people. And frankly, at least I, as a small town pastor, I often feel that a lot of the resources and conversations that are out there are more geared for, the city or the larger church than they are for the small town and the smaller church.
Right.
So hope we can benefit people in that.
Yeah, I agree. When I look at some of the things that get advertised to churches, about evangelistic programs or other things like that, it'll say, it's for churches of all sizes, even the small churches that only have 250 people, 10,000. Like, well,
yeah, that's funny.
But so our goal is to be most applicable to our two congregations as well as churches that are most similar to our two congregations, both town-wise, location-wise, physical-wise, all that fun stuff.
For sure. All right. Thank you for tuning in.
Yeah.
And we look forward to continuing this conversation with a focus on church leadership in a couple of weeks.
Yes, definitely. And be praying for the two of us in the meantime, both in our preparation and our ability to have that conversation and to do so in a manner that will be beneficial to you and to our congregations as well. But yes, I concur. Thank you for joining us for episode 1 of the Small Town Pastors video blog, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again in the future.